Every winter, thousands of truck drivers cross the frozen highways of North America. Most of them will tell you stories about blizzards, black ice, engine failures, or the exhaustion that comes from driving alone through endless nights. Those stories make sense. They belong to the world we understand. But every so often, another kind of story quietly passes from one driver to the next. Stories that are rarely written down. Stories spoken only at lonely truck stops. Over cups of burnt coffee, in voices that grow quieter whenever someone else walks into the room. Not because the stories are unbelievable, but because the people telling them know exactly what they experienced. Certain highways have earned names that never appear on official maps. Places where experienced drivers refuse to stop after dark, no matter how exhausted they are. Places where radio signals fail without explanation. Where fresh footprints appear across untouched snow. Where headlights illuminate figures that disappear the moment you step outside. Some say the mountains remember, others insist the forests do. But those who spend their lives behind the wheel often believe something far simpler. The road remembers. It remembers every accident, every final journey, every soul that never reached its destination. And on nights when the snow falls heavily enough, the past begins walking again. The testimony you were about to hear was sent to us by a long-haul truck driver from India who spent years transporting freight across the United States. He never claimed to understand what happened. He never tried to convince anyone. He simply recorded the events exactly as he remembered them. Some details can be explained, others cannot. This is his testimony. My name is Sandeep. I was born in India. But for many years, the highways of the United States became my second home. Driving wasn't simply my profession. It became my way of life. For nearly 8 years, I hauled freight across thousands of miles of American highways. Deserts, mountain passes, dense forests, small forgotten towns, and roads so isolated you could drive for hours without seeing another human being. Most people imagine freedom when they think about long-distance trucking. Open highways, beautiful landscapes, the feeling of endless travel. Those things are real, but so is the loneliness. After midnight, the road changes. Cities disappear behind you. Radio stations fade into static. The headlights become your entire world. Everything beyond them simply stops existing. You learn to trust your instincts, because sometimes they notice danger long before your eyes do. On the night this happened, I had already been driving for most of the day. My truck pulled 2 loaded trailers behind it. The weather reports warned of heavy snowfall farther north, but nothing severe enough to delay the shipment. The company tracked every vehicle through GPS. Dispatch always knew where we were. If anything went wrong, someone would eventually come looking. Eventually, by late evening, I had left the last town behind me. Civilization slowly disappeared in the mirrors. The highway narrowed. Towering pine forests closed in from both sides. Snow drifted across the asphalt like pale smoke. Visibility grew worse with every passing mile. Even the truck's powerful headlights struggled against the storm. Beyond their reach, the world dissolved into darkness. Experienced drivers learn not to fight weather like that. Nature always wins. You simply choose where to surrender. When I found a small clearing beside the highway, I decided to stop for an hour, just long enough to eat, rest my eyes, and let the snowfall ease. I had done this countless times before. There was nothing unusual about it. No warning signs, no strange feelings, nothing that suggested this night would be different from hundreds of others. That, perhaps, is the most unsettling part. Extraordinary nights rarely announce themselves. They begin looking exactly like ordinary ones. I parked the truck carefully, switched off the engine, covered the windshield from the inside using insulated curtains. Then, I covered both side windows as well. Within minutes, the cabin became a small island of warmth, floating inside an ocean of snow. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, everything felt safe, predictable, controlled. I heated water on the small stove behind the driver's seat, made myself a simple meal, instant noodles. Nothing special, just enough to keep warm before getting some rest. People often imagine truck drivers eating at roadside diners every night. Some do. I rarely did. After years in America, I still preferred cooking my own food whenever I had the chance. It reminded me of home. After eating, I stretched out on the bunk behind the driver's seat, checked my phone, answered a few messages, then switched off the cabin light. Immediately, the darkness became absolute. Not the darkness of a bedroom, not the darkness of a city street. This was something older, a darkness created by snow, forest, and distance. The kind that swallows every landmark until you begin questioning whether the world still exists beyond the truck. The heater hummed softly. Wind brushed against the trailer. Snow tapped gently against the metal body. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening, only familiar sounds. The sounds every truck driver eventually learns to ignore. I closed my eyes, certain I would fall asleep within minutes. Instead, I heard something that did not belong. At first, it was almost too faint to notice. A slow, steady rhythm. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps, walking across fresh snow, coming from somewhere beyond the truck. At first, I told myself exactly what anyone else would. Probably another driver, someone checking whether the road ahead was clear. Maybe someone looking for assistance. But another thought followed immediately, one that refused to leave. There hadn't been another vehicle on that road for almost an hour, and whoever was walking was coming directly, 7,700, toward my truck. The sound came again, slow, measured, unhurried. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Anyone who has walked across fresh snow knows that sound. It is unmistakable. Snow has a way of announcing every step, every shift of weight, every movement. Out there, nothing moves silently. The footsteps continued, steady, deliberate, growing closer. I opened my eyes and remained perfectly still. The heater continued humming beside me. The truck gently creaked as freezing winds pushed against its metal frame. Everything inside the cabin remained exactly the same. Everything outside were changing. The footsteps did not wander. They were not searching. They were not circling the road. They were coming directly toward me. That realization changed everything. I reached for my phone without making a sound. No notifications, no signal worth relying on. Even if there had been, what exactly would I report? Someone was walking outside. That was all I knew. At least, that was all I believed I knew. I listened. The distance continued shrinking. Every step sounded heavier than the last. Not rushed, not aggressive, simply certain. As though whoever was approaching already knew exactly where I was. The curtains covering the windshield allowed no light inside. The side windows were completely sealed. From where I lay, I could see absolutely nothing beyond the walls of the truck. It occurred to me then that whoever was outside could probably see just as little. The engine was off. The lights were off. The truck looked abandoned. Perhaps, if I remained completely silent, they would simply continue walking. Instead, the footsteps stopped, not beside the trailer, not near the rear wheels. directly beside the driver's cabin. Silence. Real silence. Not the peaceful silence people imagine, the kind that presses against your ears until your own heartbeat becomes unbearable. I stopped breathing for a moment, waiting, listening, expecting the footsteps to continue. They never did. Whoever had approached my truck was now standing perfectly still, only a few feet away. Seconds passed, then another minute, then another. No movement, no voice, no coughing, no shifting weight. No sound of boots adjusting against the snow. Nothing. That frightened me far more than footsteps ever could, because every living person moves, even without realizing it. They breathe, shuffle, clear their throat, stamp their feet against the cold. Nobody remains perfectly motionless for that long, especially not in the middle of a blizzard. The temperature outside had already fallen well below freezing. I had crossed roads like these for years. I knew exactly what that kind of cold could do. No ordinary traveler would stand outside without moving for several minutes. It simply wasn't possible. Yet whoever stood beside my truck never made another sound. I began convincing myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a stranded driver. Maybe someone checking whether the truck was occupied. Maybe they were waiting for me to step outside. Then another thought entered my mind, one I immediately wished had not. If they wanted help, why hadn't they knocked? I looked toward the driver's door. The lock remained secure. Every entrance had been checked before I lay down. Nobody could simply open the cabin. That thought brought me a small measure of comfort. Very small. Outside, the silence continued, long enough for doubt to creep in. Perhaps whoever had approached had already walked away. Perhaps I simply hadn't heard them leave beneath the wind. I almost believed it. Almost. Then, without warning, the driver's side door handle moved. A soft metallic click. Another. Someone was testing the lock. My entire body froze. The handle turned slowly. Stopped. Turned again. More firmly this time. Metal scraping against metal. Patient. Methodical. As though someone outside was trying to understand why the door refused to open. I didn't move. I barely blinked. My eyes remained fixed on the darkness, listening to every tiny sound. Again, the handle turned, then once more, each attempt stronger than the last. The lock held. After nearly half a minute, the pressure stopped. Silence returned. I waited, certain another attempt would follow. Instead, nothing happened. 5 seconds. 10, 30. A full minute. Nothing. Then, the footsteps returned. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Not leaving. Slowly, along the side of the truck, toward the passenger door. I followed the sound in my mind. Every step crossed the length of the cabin, until finally, it stopped again, exactly opposite where I was lying. A second lock, a second door, a second attempt. The passenger handle began to move. Once, twice, then again. Slightly harder. Whoever stood outside wasn't panicking, wasn't forcing the door, wasn't trying to break in. They behaved almost politely, testing each entrance, one after another, as though they genuinely expected one of them to open. That somehow felt even worse, because violence, I understood. Patience, I did not. Eventually, the second handle stopped moving. The silence returned once again. Longer this time, heavier, almost impossible to bear. I remember staring into the darkness, counting my own breaths, trying to estimate how much snow had accumulated outside, trying to calculate how long I could safely remain parked, thinking about absolutely anything except whoever stood beyond those thin metal doors. Then, another thought struck me. One so simple, I should have realized it immediately. I had heard someone arrive. I had heard someone walk from one side of the truck to the other, but I had never once heard anyone leave. The footsteps had simply ceased. Whoever had come through the snow was still there, standing somewhere beyond the walls of the cabin, waiting. And then, from somewhere deeper within the storm, another set of footsteps began approaching. Not one, this time, two. The first visitor had not left. Of that, I was now certain. I'd heard the footsteps arrive. I'd heard them move from one side of the truck to the other. I had heard both door handles being tested. But I had never once heard footsteps walking away. Whoever stood outside was still there, watching, waiting. Then, another sound emerged from somewhere deeper within the storm. More footsteps, not one, two, slowly making their way through the fresh snow. The rhythm was different now. The first set of footsteps had sounded lonely. These carried purpose. They approached without hesitation, following the exact same path through the snow until they finally stopped beside the truck. Now there were three of them. I couldn't see a single one. The curtains covering the windshield had transformed my cabin into a prison. Safe, perhaps, but blind. Then something happened that I still struggle to explain. They began speaking. Their voices were low, almost whispers. At first, relief washed over me. Voices meant people. People meant reason. For several seconds, I convinced myself that perhaps they were travelers. Maybe another truck had broken down. Maybe they had mistaken my vehicle for roadside assistance. But the relief vanished almost immediately, because I couldn't understand a single word. It wasn't English. It wasn't Spanish. It wasn't any language I had ever heard during my years driving across America. The sounds themselves felt wrong. There were no familiar rhythms, no recognizable syllables. It flowed like someone trying to imitate human speech without fully understanding how language worked. Sometimes the voices became almost melodic. Then suddenly they dropped into deep murmurs that barely sounded human at all. I listened carefully, trying to separate the voices. There were three. One belonged to a grown man. Another sounded like a woman. The third was unmistakably a child. That realization disturbed me more than anything else. A family, standing outside my truck, in the middle of nowhere, during a blizzard, miles away from the nearest town. How had they reached this place? Where was their vehicle? Why weren't they asking for help? Why had they spent so much time trying to open my doors without saying a single word? The questions kept multiplying. None of the answers made sense. The conversation outside continued for another minute. Occasionally, one voice would stop. Another would answer. Then all three would fall silent together. It sounded less like a discussion and more like people deciding something. I don't know how long I lay there listening. Time had begun behaving strangely. Every minute felt like 10. Every second stretched endlessly. Finally, curiosity overcame fear. I told myself I only needed a quick look, just enough to identify who was outside. Nothing more. Very slowly, I slid myself toward the passenger side curtain. Every movement felt impossibly loud. The mattress creaked beneath me. I froze. No reaction. The voices outside continued. Another inch, then another. until my fingers finally reached the edge of the curtain. I held my breath. Carefully, I pulled back the fabric no more than the width of a finger. A narrow line of white light entered the cabin. Snow reflected my headlights and the pale glow of the storm. I looked through the opening. There was nobody there. Not beside the passenger door, not beside the trailer, not on the road. Nothing, only untouched snow, the forest, and darkness. I blinked, certain I had looked in the wrong direction. Then, every voice outside stopped, instantly, as though someone had noticed me looking. I widened the gap slightly. Still nothing. No footprints moving away. No figures disappearing into the trees. Nothing. Only the empty highway. My breathing became shallow. The silence outside felt impossible. Just seconds earlier, 3 people had been standing close enough for me to hear them whispering. Now, the world appeared completely deserted. I slowly closed the curtain again. Perhaps I had imagined it. Perhaps exhaustion was finally catching up with me. Perhaps hours of driving through snow had begun affecting my mind. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. Then, before I had even settled back onto the bunk, I heard the whispers again, exactly where they had been before, right outside the truck. Not approaching, not leaving, already there. The voices resumed as though they had never stopped. Quiet, patient, completely unconcerned that I had tried to see them. That was the moment fear stopped feeling like an emotion. It became something physical. It settled inside my chest. Every instinct I possessed told me the same thing. Do not open that door. Do not answer those voices. Do not acknowledge whatever is standing outside. Nearly an hour had passed since I had parked. The snowfall was growing heavier. If I waited much longer, there was a real chance the truck would become trapped. I was faced with a choice: remain inside with something waiting outside, or risk driving through the storm. Either decision felt dangerous, but only one gave me the possibility of leaving. I slid off the bunk and quietly moved into the driver's seat. Every movement was deliberate. Every sound seemed amplified inside the silent cabin. My hand rested on the ignition key. I closed my eyes for a single moment, then turned it. The diesel engine roared to life. The sudden noise shattered the silence. The truck vibrated beneath me. I reached forward, pulled away the windshield curtain, and switched on the headlights. What they revealed would stay with me for the rest of my life. Snow swirled widely through the beams of the headlines. White flakes drifted across the road like countless tiny spirits caught in the wind. At first, I saw nothing, only the empty highway, the forest, the falling snow. Then movement appeared near the edge of the headlights. 3 figures, standing perfectly still, far enough away that the storm almost swallowed them, close enough that I could tell they had been watching the truck the entire time. A man, a woman, the child. None of them moved. None of them attempted to approach. They simply stood there, waiting. For reasons I still cannot explain, I looked directly at the child first. Perhaps because children never belong in places like that. Not in the middle of a snowstorm, not miles away from the nearest town. Not standing motionless beside a frozen highway long after midnight. The child appeared small, no older than 10, standing between the adults without holding either of their hands. The family looked almost ordinary, until my eyes adjusted to the light. That was when I noticed their faces. Every trace of color had disappeared. Their skin wasn't merely pale, it had a dull gray color of something long deprived of life. But The man's clothes hung loosely against his body. His shoulders leaned forward unnaturally. The woman stood with her head slightly lowered, as though her neck could no longer support its own weight. Then I saw the child's face. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. There was dried blood beneath the nose. Dark stains covered the mouth. The skin looked torn in several places, exposing something beneath that should never have been visible. The man's face came forth. The man's face looked worse. One side appeared crushed inward. His jaw seemed twisted at an impossible angle. The woman wore what might once have been a winter cape. Now it hung in shredded strips around her body, frozen solid beneath layers of snow. None of them blinked. None of them shivered. None of them reacted to the freezing wind. They simply watched. Every instinct screamed at me to drive. I slammed the truck into gear and pressed the accelerator. The engine roared, the wheels spun, but the truck refused to move. The tires dug deeper into the snow. The heavy trailers behind me held everything in place. For one terrifying moment, I realized I wasn't going anywhere. The family began walking, slowly, not running, not rushing. Each step was deliberate. Each foot sank into the untouched snow before rising again. The distance between us steadily disappeared. I pushed harder on the accelerator. The engine screamed. The steering wheel shook violently beneath my hands. The truck rocked. Still, nothing. The headlights illuminated them more clearly with every passing second. The closer they came, the less human they appeared. Their movements were wrong, not exaggerated, not jerky, simply empty, like puppets whose strings were being pulled by someone who had only observed human beings from a great distance. Their arms swung too little, their posture never changed, their eyes remained fixed entirely on the windshield. On me. The child continued walking between them. Small footprints formed neatly behind each step. No expression crossed that tiny face. No fear, no anger, no curiosity. Only silence. My breathing became frantic. The windshield began fogging from inside the cabin. I wiped it away with one hand while desperately trying to free the truck with the other. Again, the accelerator. Again, nothing. The family continued approaching. 30 yards. 25. 20. I remember thinking, this is where I die. Not in a highway collision. Not because of the storm. Not because of the cold. But because I stopped to rest. The thought felt absurd, yet completely real. Then, without warning, the rear tires caught solid ground. The truck lurched forward so violently that I nearly lost control of the steering wheel. The trailers jerked behind me. Snow exploded beneath the wheels. The engine finally overpowered the drift holding us in place. We were moving. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the accelerator as hard as I could. The truck surged past the three figures. For only a second, they stood directly beside my window. Close enough that I could have reached out and touched them. The man's eyes followed me without moving his head. The woman's lips were slightly open, revealing teeth darkened by dried blood. Then, the child smiled. Not a wide smile, not an evil grin, just the quiet, innocent smile of a child saying goodbye to someone leaving home. The small hand lifted slowly, a gentle wave. Nothing more. No chase, no scream, no attempt to stop me. Only a farewell. I couldn't understand why that simple gesture terrified me more than their faces ever could. I kept driving. The road disappeared beneath swirling snow. My eyes remained fixed ahead, still. Some instinct forced me to look into the side mirror. The family had not moved. They remained exactly where I had left them. 3 silent figures standing in the middle of the highway, watching my truck disappear into the storm. Long after they should have vanished behind the snowfall, I could still see them, Or perhaps I only believed I could. I wanted to convince myself it was over, that I had escaped whatever had happened beside that lonely road. I was wrong. The highway had no intention of letting me leave so easily, because only a few miles ahead, the storm had prepared something far worse than the family waiting in the sow. For several long minutes, I drove without thinking. Every instinct was focused on one thing: distance. The farther I could get from that family, the better my chances of convincing myself they had been real. Or perhaps that they had not. The snow continued falling in thick sheets, swallowing everything beyond the reach of my headlights. Visibility was almost non-existent. The road ahead had become little more than a narrow ribbon of black, surrounded by endless white. I kept both hands tightly wrapped around the steering wheel. My eyes never left the highway. I refused to look in the mirrors again. Whatever had been standing behind me could remain there. I wanted no part of it. Then the truck lurched violently beneath me. The steering wheel twisted in my hands. For a split second, I lost control. Black ice. Every truck driver fears it. You never truly see it until it's already beneath your tires. The trailer swung slightly behind me before the truck finally came to a stop at the edge of the road. The engine was still running, but the wheels spun uselessly. I eased off the accelerator, tried again. Nothing. The truck refused to move. I tried rocking it gently forward, then backward. Again, nothing. Each attempt buried the tires deeper into the frozen snow. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. Of all the places, of all the nights, this was where the truck chose to become trapped. Outside, the storm continued to erase the world. Inside the cabin, I reached for the company radio. The familiar crackle of static filled the speaker. Then, dispatch answered. Hearing another human voice almost made me forget everything that had happened. I reported my location, explained that I had lost traction and become stranded on black ice. Nothing more. I didn't mention the footsteps. I didn't mention the family. How could I? Even saying the words aloud made them sound impossible. Dispatch checked my GPS location. After several moments, they came back over the radio. There should be a repair workshop about 5 kilometers east of your position. 5 kilometers. Under normal conditions, that would have meant only a few minutes. Tonight, it felt like another country. They tried contacting the workshop. No response. They tried again. Still nothing. Finally, they told me they would continue trying while I waited inside the truck. It was sensible advice. It was probably the correct advice. But I kept looking through the windshield. The snowfall was becoming heavier by the minute. Soon, the truck would be buried even deeper. If help didn't arrive before dawn, recovering 2 loaded trailers would become a far greater problem. I began weighing my options. Stay where I was, or go looking for help myself. Neither choice felt safe. One trapped me with the storm. The other required walking back through the same stretch of forest I had barely escaped. I wish I could tell you I made the smart decision. I didn't. I dressed as quickly as I could. Heavy winter jacket, thermal gloves, boots, a flashlight powerful enough to cut through the snow, my portable radio. Nothing more. Before opening the door, I hesitated. The memory of those hands trying both locks returned so vividly that my fingers refused to move. I stared at the handle for several seconds, then reminded myself of something important. The family was gone. I had driven several miles away. Whatever they had been, they were behind me now. I opened the door. The cold hit me instantly. It wasn't simply cold. It was alive. The kind of cold that forces the air from your lungs before you've even taken a step. Snow reached nearly to my ankles. The wind carried thousands of tiny ice crystals that stung every exposed piece of skin. I closed the truck door behind me and swept my flashlight across the highway. Nothing. Only falling snow. Only trees. Only silence. For the first time since leaving the truck, I looked back at the road behind me. No figures. No movement. No family. Just endless white, disappearing into darkness. I allowed myself a slow breath. Perhaps it really was over. Then my flashlight dropped toward the ground. My heart nearly stopped. Fresh footprints. 3 separate trails. The snow had continued falling for nearly an hour. My own tire tracks were already disappearing beneath fresh layers of white. Yet these footprints remained perfectly defined. A man's south, a woman's south, a child's, leading away from the road. Leading toward the forest. I stared at them for several long moments, trying to understand, trying to convince myself they belonged to someone else. But deep inside, I already knew. The spacing, the size, the 3 parallel paths. They matched exactly what I had seen beneath my headlights. Dispatch called through the radio, asking for an update. Their voice pulled me back to reality. I answered calmly, far more calmly than I actually felt. Then I began walking. The footprints became my guide, not because I wanted to follow them, because they were leading in exactly the same direction as the workshop. With every step, I hoped the tracks would disappear. Instead, they became clearer, as though whatever had made them wanted to be followed. The forest closed around me once again. Snow muffled every sound except my own breathing. The beam of my flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Everything beyond that circle of light ceased to exist. Time lost its meaning. 10 minutes, 20, perhaps 30. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A house, standing completely alone, half buried beneath snow. Its roof sagged with age. The wooden walls leaned ever so slightly, as though time itself had grown tired of holding them upright. No road led to it. No vehicle stood outside. No footprints, except the 3 I had been following. And every one of them ended at the front door. Something about the place felt profoundly wrong. Not abandoned, not ruined, waiting. The windows were dark. Yet, as I moved closer, I noticed a faint orange glow flickering somewhere inside. Firelight. Someone or something was home. I should have turned around. Every instinct I possessed begged me to leave that place. Instead, I walked toward the front door, because by then, I had convinced myself of the most dangerous lie a frightened man can believe, that whatever had happened on the highway could still be explained. The closer I came, the older the house appeared. It looked as though it had survived decades of winters by refusing to collapse. Snow rested heavily upon its roof. The wooden walls were weathered almost black. Several windows had been boarded shut years ago. Others were cracked, their glass covered with frost, so thick it looked like cataracts over blind eyes. No tire tracks reached the property. No footprints surrounded it. Only the 3 trails I had been following through the forest. A man's south, a woman's south. Each one ended at the front porch. None came back out. I stood there, listening. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps. Not even the wind seemed willing to disturb that place. Then I noticed it. A warm orange glow flickering behind one of the windows. Fire. Someone had lit a fireplace, which meant one thing. The house wasn't abandoned. Relief mixed with suspicion. If people lived here, perhaps they could help me. Perhaps the family I had seen on the highway lived here after all. Perhaps exhaustion had exaggerated everything else. I needed that explanation. I walked toward the nearest window, carefully, quietly. The snow muffled every step. When I reached the glass, I cupped my hands around my eyes and looked inside. A fireplace burned brightly. Its flames danced across old wooden furniture. An armchair sat beside the fire. A dining table stood neatly arranged. A kettle rested above glowing embers. The room looked lived in, comfortable, warm, but it was empty. Not a single person. I frowned. Perhaps whoever lived there was in another room. I moved to the next window. Again, nothing. Another room, perfectly furnished, perfectly silent. No movement, no shadows, no sign of life. Only the fire continued burning. That should have been impossible. Someone had to be feeding it. I circled farther around the house. Every window showed the same thing. Rooms prepared for people, without people. It felt less like a home, and more like a memory of one. I returned to the front porch. The footprints still ended at the door. No new tracks appeared around the building. No evidence suggested anyone had left. My flashlight beam settled on the old wooden handle. I hesitated. Every sensible thought told me to leave. Call dispatch again. Wait for daylight. Forget the workshop. Forget the house. But another voice inside me whispered something far more dangerous. If someone truly lived here, they might have a telephone, a vehicle, a snowmobile, anything that could get me back to my truck. I reached for the handle. The wood felt strangely warm despite the freezing air. Slowly, I turned it. The door opened without resistance. No creaking hinges, no protest, as though someone had opened it only moments earlier. Warm air drifted out into the night. The smell surprised me. Old wood, burning pine, and something else, a faint sweetness I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, just strangely familiar. I stepped inside. The silence followed me. My boots left wet prints across the wooden floor. Behind me, the open doorway framed nothing except swirling snow. For several seconds, I simply stood there, waiting, listening. Hello. My own voice sounded foreign inside the house. No answer. Only the soft crackling of the fireplace. I moved deeper inside. The living room was exactly as I had seen through the window. Everything sat perfectly arranged. Books rested neatly upon shelves. A blanket lay folded over the armchair. A teacup stood beside the fireplace. Steam no longer rose from it. But the tea hadn't completely frozen either. Someone had been here, recently. Or at least, it looked that way. The radio exploded with static. "Sandeep!" The sudden voice echoed through the empty hallway. I nearly dropped the radio. "Sandeep, do you copy?" The volume was still turned all the way up. I grabbed it immediately. "I'm here." Static answered. Then dispatch returned. "Sandeep, your GPS hasn't moved for several minutes. Are you all right?" The words had barely left the speaker when another sound reached my ears. Outside. A dog. Barking. Not ordinary barking. Aggressive. Furious. Getting closer. Then, footsteps. Not one. Not two. Three. Walking across the snow toward the house. I froze. The radio slipped from my fingers and struck the wooden floor with a sharp crack. The barking stopped. So did the footsteps. Silence. Then, the front porch groaned. Someone had just stepped onto it. I looked toward the doorway. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear it inside my ears. They had come back, and this time, they knew exactly where I was. The first sound wasn't a footstep. It wasn't a voice. It was the crackling burst of my own walkie-talkie. I had forgotten one simple thing. The volume was still turned all the way up. Until that moment, the house had remained perfectly silent. Then the radio suddenly came alive. "Sandeep! Sandeep, do you copy?" The voice echoed through the empty rooms like a flare fired into the night. I froze. My blood seemed to stop moving. "Sandeep, respond." The transmission repeated once more. Outside, the dog began barking. Not ordinary barking, not the warning bark of an animal protecting its territory. It sounded frightened, desperate, as though it had been trying to stay quiet. Until the radio told it exactly where I was. The barking came closer. Then I heard footsteps outside the house. Several of them. Not hurried, not confused. Deliberate. Measured. As though whoever stood outside already knew where they were going. I looked around desperately for some way to escape. There was no time to escape through the front door. No time to search another room. Near the hallway stood a narrow storage closet. I slipped inside and pulled the door almost shut, leaving only the smallest opening through which I could see the room. Then I waited. Every second stretched into something unbearable. The front door creaked open. Cold wind swept through the hallway. Then they entered. The same three figures. The man, the woman, the child. For the first time, I saw them beneath proper light, not clearly enough to study every detail, but enough to know they did not belong among the living. Their clothing looked decades old, wet, stained. Their skin possessed that strange color only winter gives to something that has remained frozen far too long. Yet they moved naturally, calmly, as though they had returned home after a long journey. None of them spoke English. None of them spoke any language I recognized. Instead, they whispered, soft sounds, broken syllables, almost musical. Not conversation, not argument, something older, something that sounded less like speech and more like memory. The child looked toward the fireplace. The woman slowly walked around the room. The man remained near the entrance. Then, all three stopped moving at exactly the same moment. Their heads lifted together, not toward the ceiling, toward the air, toward my scent. I watched the woman's chest rise slowly. She inhaled deeply. The man did the same. Then the child, one after another. Long, patient, deliberate breaths. As though they weren't searching with their eyes, they were searching with their lungs. The realization struck me with terrifying clarity. They knew. Not where I was, but that I was there. The child turned first. Without speaking, without expression, he began walking toward the storage room. Each small footstep echoed through the old wooden floor. Behind him, the woman followed. Then the man. None of them hurried. Predators never hurry once they know their prey cannot escape. I pressed myself farther into the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me not to breathe, not to move, not to blink. Outside, the dog was barking uncontrollably now. The sound had changed. It no longer sounded like warning. It sounded like panic. The child stopped only a few feet from the closet door. His head tilted slowly to one side, then to the other. Almost curious, he inhaled again. A slow, deep breath. The woman mirrored him. Then the man. 3 silent figures. Breathing, listening, waiting. The closet suddenly felt impossibly small. My heart pounded so violently I became certain they could hear it. I searched desperately with my hands. Anything that could help me. My fingers touched cold metal. I couldn't see what it was, only that it was heavy. Beside it, an old oil lamp burned quietly against the wall. Its glass chimney cast trembling shadows across the room. An impossible thought entered my mind. If they could see, they could hunt. If they hunted by scent, Perhaps darkness would give me one chance. One. Nothing more. I gripped the metal object with both hands, waited until the child leaned one step closer. Then, I swung with everything I had. The object struck the lamp. Glass exploded. Oil spilled across the floor. The flame vanished instantly. The entire house collapsed into absolute darkness. For one heartbeat, everything became silent. Then, the screaming began. Not human screams, not animal cries, something between both, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every room at once. The dog erupted into furious barking. Furniture crashed somewhere behind me. I threw open the closet door, ran blindly through the darkness. My shoulder slammed into a doorway. I stumbled, caught myself, then burst through the front entrance into the blinding snow. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Not 3, many, far more than had entered the house. And for the first time that entire night, I stopped wondering what they wanted. Because I finally understood one thing. They weren't trying to enter the truck. They weren't trying to speak. They weren't asking for help. They had been hunting. And now, they knew exactly where I was. The moment I burst through the doorway, I didn't look back. The frozen ground vanished beneath my boots as I threw myself into the storm, stumbling through snow that reached almost to my knees. Behind me, I heard the dog, not barking anymore, charging. The sound of claws tearing through frozen earth echoed somewhere inside the darkness, accompanied by those strange voices speaking in a language that seemed to belong to no nation I had ever heard. I didn't stop to understand them. I ran. Branches whipped across my face. Snow blinded me. Every breath felt like shards of ice cutting into my lungs. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that house. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, throwing broken beams across trees that all looked identical. Every direction appeared the same. Every shadow seemed alive. Several times I slipped. Each time I imagined cold hands reaching through the snow toward my ankles. Each time I forced myself back to my feet before fear could freeze me where I stood. The climb became steeper. I hadn't realized I was heading uphill until my legs began burning beneath the weight of soaked winter clothing. Somewhere behind me, the voices had stopped. That frightened me even more, when predators stop making noise. It usually means they no longer need to search. They already know where you are. I kept climbing. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. The snowstorm swallowed every landmark. The world had become nothing but white ground, black trees, and endless silence. Then, through the blowing snow, I saw something impossible. A faint orange glow. At first, I thought exhaustion had begun playing tricks on my eyes, but the light remained steady, warm, human. I pushed toward it with whatever strength I had left. As I reached the top of the hillside, the forest suddenly opened. A narrow service road cut across the mountain. Beyond it stood several weathered buildings, a repair garage, a small workshop, a fuel station, and beside them, a modest roadside motel. For the first time that entire night, I saw signs of ordinary life. The workshop lights were still on. I staggered toward them, barely able to feel my feet. Before I reached the entrance, the door opened. An older man stepped outside, followed by a younger couple and a teenage boy. The moment they saw my condition, they hurried toward me without asking questions. Someone grabbed my arm. Someone else took my flashlight. They helped me inside. Heat wrapped around me so suddenly that my entire body began shaking uncontrollably. Only then did I realize how close I had come to freezing. They sat me beside a stone fireplace. Someone placed a thick blanket over my shoulders. A steaming mug of coffee was pressed into my hands. For several minutes, nobody asked what had happened. They simply waited for me to breathe normally again. Eventually, the older man spoke. "You came through the lower forest, didn't you?" His voice was calm, too calm. I nodded. His expression changed, not with surprise, but with recognition. Slowly, I told them everything. The truck, the footsteps, the family standing in the snow, the abandoned house, the voices, the dog, the impossible escape. When I finished, the room remained completely silent. No one laughed. No one exchanged doubtful looks. Instead, they looked at one another as though they had heard the same story many times before. Finally, the old mechanic leaned forward. "That house has been empty for over 100 years. The fire crackled softly between us. He continued. "In the winter of 1915, a family lived there. A husband, his wife, and their young son. They kept to themselves. The nearest town was miles away. People rarely visited. One night, bandits came through the mountains. They robbed the house, and before they left, they murdered everyone inside." No one interrupted him. Outside, the wind continued sweeping across the mountain. The house was abandoned after that, but the family, he stopped, as though choosing his next words carefully, never seemed to leave. He explained that truck drivers, hunters, snowplow operators, and even state highway workers had reported seeing them for decades. Always during heavy snowfall. Always after midnight. A man, a woman, a child, sometimes standing beside the highway, sometimes walking through the forest, sometimes appearing near abandoned vehicles, as though waiting for someone to stop. Most people who encountered them escaped with nothing more than a story. A few were never found. No official report ever connected those disappearances, but among people who spent their lives driving those mountain roads, everyone knew about the old house. Everyone knew about the family. And everyone knew one rule: never follow footprints into the forest. The old mechanic stared into the fire for several moments before speaking again. "You were lucky." I looked at him. He slowly shook his head. "No," he whispered. "They let you leave. For reasons I still cannot explain, those words frightened me more than everything that had happened inside the forest. Because luck suggests chance. His words suggested choice. And that possibility has stayed with me ever since." Morning finally arrived, but daylight did little to erase what the night had left behind. The storm had weakened enough for us to return to my truck. The workshop owner and two of his workers drove with me through the mountain pass. The road looked completely ordinary. Fresh snow, silent pine trees, nothing that hinted of what had happened only hours earlier. When we reached our truck, it was still where I had abandoned it, half buried beneath snow. The workers attached recovery chains and slowly pulled it free from the ice. Apart from frozen tires and packed snow, there was no visible damage. The cabin doors remained locked. The handles were untouched. No broken locks, no scratches. No footprints surrounding the vehicle. It was as though the mountain itself had erased every trace of the night before. Had I relied only on physical evidence, I might eventually have convinced myself exhaustion had created the entire experience. But before leaving, I asked if we could stop one last time. Not at the house. No one was willing to drive that close. Instead, I stood at a distance where the abandoned cabin was barely visible through the trees. The roof sagged beneath decades of snow. Its windows were dark, silent, lifeless. It looked incapable of holding anything except dust and forgotten memories. I removed the instant camera I carried in my truck. Back then, Many drivers kept one for documenting accidents and damaged cargo. I aimed it toward the house, pressed a shutter, and waited. The small photograph slowly developed inside my hand. At first, everything looked perfectly normal. Snow, trees, the abandoned house, nothing else. Then, shapes began appearing. 3 of them, standing near the front porch. A man, a woman, and a small child. Exactly where no one had been standing when I took the photograph. I stared at the picture for what felt like forever. The workers noticed my face change. One of them quietly asked what was wrong. I couldn't answer. I simply turned the photograph around and handed it to him. He looked at it for several seconds. Without saying a word, he handed it back. Then he walked straight to his truck. No one spoke during the drive back. Not once. I kept that photograph. I still have it. I've shown it to only a handful of people during the last 8 years. Some believe it. Others tell me it must be a camera defect, a trick of light, an overexposed image. Perhaps they're right. I stopped trying to convince anyone a long time ago. Because I know what I heard. I know what tried to open my truck doors. I know what waited outside in the snow without leaving. And I know the faces I saw illuminated by my headlights. I've continued driving trucks across America ever since. I've crossed deserts, forests, mountain passes, blizzards. I've parked alone beside thousands of miles of empty highway. Fear no longer keeps me awake. Experience does. Because there is one stretch of road, one forgotten mountain, that I have never driven again. Not because the road is dangerous, not because the weather is unpredictable, but because somewhere beyond those trees, an old house still waits beneath the snow. And on winter nights, when the storm becomes heavy enough to erase the world, I sometimes wonder if a man, a woman, and a little boy are still standing outside, waiting for the next lonely truck to stop.